Funding for this edition of Remember Them with Steve Adubato and Jacqui Tricarico has been provided by Holy Name. This place is different. Choose New Jersey. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Working for a healthier, more equitable New Jersey. Newark Board of Education. The Northward Center. The New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Community Food Bank of New Jersey. And by Seton Hall University, showing the world what great minds can do since 1856. Promotional support provided by NJ.com, keeping communities informed and connected. And by ROINJ, informing and connecting businesses in New Jersey.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Adubato for Remember Them with my colleague Jacqui Tricarico, our co-anchor and executive producer. Today, Jacqui, we look at the recently deceased governor of New Jersey, former governor of New Jersey, Jim Florio, a very important figure in New Jersey and American history. We talked to people who knew Florio well. Who do we talk to?
Yeah, we're speaking with David Wildstein with NJ Globe, and then also Dale Florio, not related, same last name, but knows about Dale knows a lot about Jim Florio. And gives us a little bit about him. But then we also we're going to look at some clips from an interview you did with him from 1998. This is
with Governor Florio.
With Governor Florio. Yep. This is after he was governor and kind of recapping some of the highlights from his career, some of the things he learned along the way. And also he talks about what he was doing after his governorship. And Steve, I know you had an interesting relationship with Governor Florio. This was one interview you did with him, but there were so many before that as well, right?
You know, you're going to see an interview that Jacqui said from 1998, but I remember an interview I did with Governor Florio. He was elected in 1989, lost the governorship in 1993 to Christie Whitman. But during that time, during Florio's term, now remember, he pushed for an income tax, not just an income tax increase, but a tax increase of $2.8 billion. They increased taxes on toilet paper. They were throwing toilet paper at the State House. People were so angry at Jim Florio across the state, but he risked political capital to do that. He thought it would be unpopular. And in a series of interviews, I remember asking him, Jacqui, Governor, didn't you realize that it would be unpopular? And he said, well, I didn't realize it would be that unpopular. And then we had a whole back and forth about the importance of personality and smiling and having an ability to connect with people on a human level and communication. And he used to argue with me, telling me it was overrated, that if you do your job, that's all your job is as a leader. Governor Florio and I had contentious interviews. I respected him tremendously, but we did not see the world in the same way, particularly public life, Jacqui.
And I think he hits upon that a little bit in this 1998 interview that you did with him about not having enough of a pulse on what is actually going on with people in the state of New Jersey during that time, working class, lower class people. And he did admit that he didn't have a total understanding of what was really happening and just how significant that tax increase was for everyone. So he does talk a little bit about that during your interview with him.
Yeah, Florio's view was that you do the right thing, you tell people what you're doing. And I thought, again, I would argue with Florio, not argue because it wasn't my job to debate him, but we did see the need to communicate and connect with people differently. But Governor Florio, at the end of this, we have a really important interview, and I'm glad we got to do that because so many of the interviews before that were, let's just say, contentious. But right now you're going to see Dale Florio, no relation to David Wildstein from NJ Globe. So for Jacqui, myself, and the Remember Them team, we remember the Honorable Governor Jim Florio. We're now joined by David Wildstein, New Jersey Globe, the editor. Check out their website. Hey, David, I say Jim Florio, you say.
What I say today is different than what I said when he was governor. When he was governor, I thought what he did was, in raising taxes, $2.8 million. I mean, it
that would be a billion, not
billion,
a billion, not million.
dollars. Yeah, that's the problem in politics. They all start to look, the numbers. But you're absolutely right. And but it cost a lot of people their political careers. Now that I've gotten older, now that I've had a chance to really think about Governor Florio, to get to know Governor Florio over the years, I mean, this man had incredible bravery in terms of doing what he thought he had to do. This was a governor who got into office and refused to kick the can down the road. He said, we've got some problems. We need to fix them. We need to fix them now. If it costs me the governorship, then so be it. He did what he believed in. He was entirely comfortable in his own skin.
And Florio, again, raising taxes, $2.8 billion, largely to fund the schools, to provide state aid to local school districts, to create a greater degree of parity, if you will, or fairness within our public school systems with poorer districts. And also the Supreme Court very involved in the Abbott versus Burke decision, later Robinson versus Burke. But I got to ask you something. I interviewed Governor Florio many times, and the clip we're going to show will be a very congenial, respectful interview. They weren't all like that. And to be super candid about this, some of them were incredibly contentious. Yeah. And I used to debate with him and say, Governor, doesn't personality matter? Doesn't it matter that you don't smile very much, you don't seem very nice, and you're always peeved in media interviews when you get asked questions you don't like? Am I overstating that, David?
No. I mean, you have to remember the origins of Jim Florio. He grew up in a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn. He was a boxer, dropped out of high school, went into the Navy, and then went to college, and then went to law school, and then he was a prosecutor, and he was a tough prosecutor, and he was a congressman working on,
Superfund.
Dove into the Superfund, right? I mean,
was everything a fight for Florio?
Everything. I mean, remember the battle to become governor. He ran against Brendan Byrne in a primary. Byrne was the sitting incumbent.
I think 1977.
77. Florio challenged him, ran for governor in 81, and it was the closest race in the history of the state. Fractions of a couple tenths of a point, or he would have been governor. Waits, goes back to Congress, does the job, not as a consolation prize, but just throws himself in to environmental issues and gun issues. Comes back in 89, wins in a landslide, and then he raises taxes. And all of a sudden, the political world around him began to unravel. Republicans won both houses of the legislature, but I hope it doesn't sound corny, but New Jersey is the state of Frank Sinatra, and Jim Florio did it his way.
So does David Wildstein and New Jersey Globe. He does it his way, and check it out on a regular basis. David talking about the Honorable, the late Jim Florio. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Steve.
We continue talking about former governor, the late Jim Florio, with Dale Florio, no relation, Dale J. Florio, Republican strategist and managing partner, Princeton Public Affairs Group. Hey, Dale, let me ask you, you had the same last name, different parties, not related. What, if any, impact did that have on your relationship and interaction with the late Governor Jim Florio?
It was always a positive one. I mean, when he came onto the scene, I was just a young. When he was coming to the state level, I was just starting out. So we kind of started together, and through a few of his people, he heard about me, and I just remember the first time that we connected, and he just leaned over to me and said, "Just don't abuse the name." And I.
Wait a minute. So hold on. Even though he was never that chatty with me in interviews, usually teased at me for something I asked, he was friendly and light with you.
It was whimsical, right? Which was unusual for the governor. I mean, he was always pretty straight-laced, very serious guy. But because I was a lobbyist and that's all he knew about me, he didn't want things to get confused. But so he just said, just don't abuse it. And I took that to heart, and we had a great relationship ever since. I mean, it was very, very cordial, and we would always catch up.
Even though ideologically, politically, different places, you come at politics differently, what would you say his greatest contribution was as governor?
Really, from a policy standpoint, I mean, whether you agreed with him or not, I'm sure there were some politics buried into some of his decisions, but you knew why he was supporting a particular piece of legislation or you didn't. So I would say it was I think he brought a higher level of policy to state government than folks had seen before. And that's not to discount, obviously, Governor Kane, but I'm just saying that at least in my experience since Jim Florio, he was a governor that, there was a lot of policy behind what he stood for.
So even though you were against the income tax increase, the significant $2.8 billion tax increase, you weren't alone, Dale. I covered it, believe me, you weren't alone. He believed that that was the right thing to do, to raise more money to fund the public schools from the state to local government, to local school districts. He believed that. Whether people thought it was right or wrong, or whether he lost or not, and he did lose, he believed that. And there's something to be said for that.
Well, there is. I mean, and you could argue, though, that he wasn't the best communicator. It's one thing, I mean, I think people will follow if they know that you really believe this is the right way to go. And when they did that $2.8 billion worth of taxes, right? And then the toilet paper tax, and then the regulation on dealing with runny eggs in public restaurants, the people were just like, so he didn't articulate his message, despite the fact that that money was going to be used for the environment, despite the fact the money was going to be used for the schools. Right, exactly. So
you know what's interesting about that? Sorry for cutting you off. I remember I said this before. We did so many interviews, and I kept asking him, Governor, what about connecting with people and the communication part? And he always used to tell me that it was overrated. You're smiling because.
Well, I mean, listen, I think that was part of his problem. I mean, he only lost the re-election by what? Right, that much?
Very small margin.
Under 25,000 votes.
If he had been a better communicator and friendlier on the campaign trail, friendlier to others, do you think it would have made a difference?
Without a doubt. And the other thing that I noticed in his first run for governor, when he won the first time, Lucinda was at his side at a lot of events.
His wife.
Yes, and she wasn't, at least in the events that I saw, and the newspaper stories and the events, I didn't see her around as much. I'm sure she had other things going on.
In 93.
I think if she had been a bigger part of that campaign, because she presented a softer side, right? She was always smiling, very nice person, which would offset his, he had that fighter's mentality all the time. I mean, he was a serious guy.
He was a boxer in the Navy from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Came to Jersey, Camden. Hey, Dale, thank you for sharing your thoughts on the late governor, the Honorable Jim Florio. Thank you, Dale.
Good to see you. Take care.
Good to see you.
To see more Remember Them programs, visit us online at steveadubato.org. If you would like to express an opinion, email us at info@caucusnj.org. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Steve Adubato, PhD, and follow us on Twitter at Steve Adubato.
Governor Jim Florio, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Let's put things in perspective. I can't imagine anyone watching. You don't really need a big intro because everyone knows you served as governor for 4 years, a few years back. And what they don't know is what you've been doing since then. So bring us up to speed. What kinds of things has Jim Florio been doing?
Doing a lot of interesting things. I came out of office, and Lucinda and I have talked about this, without a job, no car for either of us, no real estate, and spent my entire adult life working in the public sector.
United States Congress, and then
the legislature for
right.
about 6 years, and then congressman for 16 years, and then governor for 4 years. So we started out, which is fine if you're a couple starting out 20 building a life. We were a little bit more than 20 when we started out. But actually the last 4 or 5 years have been very, very good for us, satisfying for the two of us. Started the business of my own, a small law firm, which has been growing and doing reasonably well. Started a financial consulting company, a management company, which has been very interesting for me, helping small, medium-sized businesses access the capital market.
Right.
And that's been very important for me to understand a little bit about. I understand capital from a public sector perspective, but never had the understanding by virtue of experience on the private sector side. I understand now a little bit better about the problems that business people have, small business people especially.
Right.
I
the
teach,
problems with government.
and
right.
vice versa.
Right. Excuse me, I interrupted you. You're teaching as well at the university, at Rutgers.
I'm teaching at Rutgers at the Blaustein School. I teach a graduate course on particularly focusing on energy and environmental policy, which I know something about and enjoyed. I have a radio program at WCTC, which is a station in New Brunswick, a call-in show, which I enjoy as well. And then I do a whole bunch of sort of pro bono things. I'm on the board at the Regional Plan Association. Right. I've worked in Washington with Secretary Reich when he was at the Labor Department, head of the task force that looked at the changing nature of the workplace. I'm on the advisory board to the Secretary of Energy, and on and on and on. So I enjoy those types of things because it keeps me a bit involved in public policy. And I enjoy public policy as well as working now in the private sector.
Beyond that, we talked about this before we got on the air. Every time I see you, you always look in great shape. You continue to work out, you run, dabbling a little bit with weights, trying to take care of yourself. But talk to me about the impact this lack of civility, this personal kind of politics, the media presenting issues with polar positions. Talk to us about the price we pay as a society, as a state, as a country, as a society in terms of not solving difficult, complex problems.
I mean, the obvious point is that we will have much less conflict resolution. We will have perpetual winning and losing situations. Somebody leaves the field with no prospect of being successful. And that then means that people will look and say, well, the problem that I'm concerned about, or the problem that we collectively as a society are concerned about, is not being resolved. We have mechanisms that are supposed to be problem-solving mechanisms. They're not resolving things, therefore something's not working.
Right.
And then there's a human tendency to say, well, if something's not working, there's a reason for it. And then the concern is that someone comes out of the woodwork and says, well, I know the reason. It's them, it's that group, it's whatever. And so you have perpetual alienation that comes from the failure to have problems resolved in a satisfactory way.
Let's do this. Let's get more specific, because you've got strong views on a whole range of issues, not just tax policy, which people know you for, but also environmental policy, deregulation, as you talked about before. Talk to me about Christie Whitman and evaluate her as a governor as she moves into her second term.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you can evaluate someone in a position of authority, particularly an executive, and executive positions are much more easily categorized than our legislative positions, a member of Congress or a senator or something of that sort. But in some respects, your success is determined by your goals. If you have an activist approach to wanting to do something, then it is a little more difficult because you are going to have to take the reins and be able to move something in a way to resolve a problem. Identify a problem, formulate a process to deal with the problem, and that's somewhat complex. Build a consensus around the solution, and then execute to try to implement the solution and then carry it out.
Let's get right down to it. Governor Whitman came in saying she wanted to cut taxes and make government smaller. Has she succeeded?
And she has cut taxes. The question, of course, is which taxes and for whom. And I suppose the credit that goes to the governor, she said she was going to cut the income tax by 30%, and she did. The problem, of course, is that the second part is how it was done and whether it has really advanced the state to a point that we're all sort of benefiting from.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that the end result of the cutting of the taxes and the failure to reduce expenditures in the state has resulted in a huge hole. The hole was filled by not making payments to the state pension fund to the tune of almost $3 billion. And then, of course, when that became a serious problem, we had to go float a bond issue to the tune of about $2.8 billion, which is going to cost us $9 billion to pay back.
What does that mean to the average person? Why should they care about that?
Well, it means that at some point down the road, and the big payments start in the year 2001, that we will have annual payments of the interest on the debt to borrow to pay that of about $1.2 billion per year and up from that point. So the answer is nothing is for nothing. And what we've been doing and what we will continue to do is defer. Now, again, I will be the devil's advocate on behalf of the administration's position, say, well, that's then, this is now, the economy is doing very well from a national perspective, and we can afford to go spend in the way that we have been spending for the last couple of years.
Isn't that pretty risky?
Well, it is risky, and it will catch up with you. I mean, I suspect, you don't want to be overly cynical about this, but I suspect someone said, well, it'll catch up, but we'll be gone by the time it catches up.
Is that irresponsible?
Well, I'm not convinced that it's responsible, and therefore it's going to be for everyone else to make their minds up when the economy turns down. And obviously it will at some point. You're going to have all these interest payments coming due. You're going to have the increased expenditures that we've had no longer being able to be afforded because the revenues that are coming in now will slow down. And at that point, you're going to have hard decisions. And the problem, of course, is that we have now so poisoned the well of public debate about revenues and expenditures that no one is going to be able to come forward easily and say, well, it's time to pay the bills. And that is going to be the problem that results in sort of almost disassembling of the system. Now, again, I'm convinced that people, if they're willing to stand up and talk common sense to people, if you treat people like adults, which they are, you can make the case for hard choices. People every day of their lives, people make hard decisions, they make choices. Why should we believe that people aren't capable of making hard choices in their public lives?
But Governor, excuse me, you make a compelling argument there, and history is a good teacher in this. And so I ask you, you use the number of $2.8 billion in terms of floating the bond. That's a number that's obviously familiar in terms of, that was the amount of the tax increase that you spearheaded back then. Common sense, you thought it made sense. You continue to think it made sense. Raise the money, the school funding issue. Why was it so hard to make that common sense argument to the masses, even though you lost re-election by a very narrow margin, which some people forget?
No, you just pointed it out. It is not something that's impossible. It is not an easy thing to do, particularly the climate, the public climate, the political climate for the last 15 years or so has started out from the premise that government monies are just wasted monies, and that government, as President Reagan said, is the problem, not the solution. And that's a nice, somewhat overly simplified approach, and there's an economic law called Gresham's law that bad money pushes good money out of the marketplace. Well, a bad, simple idea will push out of the marketplace a complicated idea. If there's anything that I've really learned in the last 4 or 5 years being out of office that I wish I had known at an earlier point in time, it is the difficulty of communicating with folks in large measure because folks are preoccupied with living their lives. I, as you know, I was out working, I thought, very hard, trying to get a message out there, and somewhat frustrated that the message didn't seem to be being picked up, because I thought, folks do know that you've got to pay for things.
All they heard was Florio's hitting us in the pocketbook. The media played on that. The Republicans went after it. And so that played well. But it was more complex than that.
I guess what my observation is from the last couple of years is that I did not have a really fully developed sense of the difficulties of life that people are experiencing. People traveling to work,
right,
gridlock, road problems, insecurity in their jobs, other types of things. I was assuming, somewhat arrogantly perhaps, that folks are out there listening to the debate, my version of it, the opponent's version of it, when in fact the vast majority of people are just too preoccupied with their lives to be fully engaged, one side or the other side. And it is a difficult state to communicate in to start with. But I just think that for political people in general from this point forward, Democrats, Republicans, whoever, they have to better understand that people have to be communicated with in the realm of their concerns, that you've got to go and say, this policy that I'm advocating or that I'm opposing is relevant to your life for this particular purpose.
And if you can't do that, they won't
And if you
listen.
can't do that, you will not even be able to hook into people.
Right.
Now, there's two parts of it, and we touched on one earlier, taking the complexities of problems, reducing them to understandable but not superficial terms,
right,
and then figuring out what the vehicles for communication are. When I first started in government, I ran for Congress in my district, and I had the reputation, I was very pleased about that, as the coffee klatch congressman. I mean, and I really did an awful lot of that sort of thing, going
Retail
into people's
politics.
homes, retail, going and talking to 20 people in somebody's home, spending an hour or two there talking issues. People
Can't do that as governor, though.
You can't do that nowadays easily, but I guess what I'm looking for is the electronic alternative to being able to communicate with people in their homes. And this is a little bit of it, but we've got to do more and more of that. In the context of campaigns, it becomes very difficult, and so we rely upon the stupid little 10-second commercial that
Attacks, calls names.
compete with
Right.
each other to be less substantive.
Let's do this, because even though this isn't a 10-second soundbite, Governor, I cannot believe that a half hour is going by this quickly. We've got a couple minutes left. Let me ask you this. We're doing a series called New Jersey, the New Century, looking ahead at some of the challenges, issues, trends that we're facing. And in just a couple of minutes, tell us the key issues you believe the state is facing and we must deal with, or we will continue to pay, or we will pay a price.
Well, you just made my point in terms of tell me in a couple of minutes the key issues, which of course is very, very difficult to do, and therefore we're going to have to make the time. Yeah. We make the time to be able to talk about these things, which by definition are growing more complex. Again, to sort of play into the game,
Sure, right.
the key thing I would say is that we've got to learn how we bring everybody into an optimistic mode of thinking about opportunity in the future. Can't leave people behind. Now, to this point, we have left a whole lot of poor people behind, and nobody apparently is overly concerned about them. I'm suggesting that the next big piece is, after we deal with that problem, how do you bring middle-class folks into an optimistic mode of looking at the future? That's not going to be an easy thing, because the world is changing, and the folks at the top will do very, very well. And the top is getting broader, and that's good.
Right.
But there are still going to be large chunks of people in the middle, and certainly the residual folks at the bottom, who are going to have to be, in a sense, brought in to feel good about themselves, have their talents, have their skills that are marketable, and be able to look brightly into the future.
It's been an honor, Governor.
Thank you.
We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Remember Them with Steve Adubato and Jacqui Tricarico has been a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by Holy Name, Choose New Jersey, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Newark Board of Education, the Northward Center, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, Community Food Bank of New Jersey, and by Seton Hall University. Promotional support provided by NJ.com and by ROINJ. To watch more Remember Them with Steve Adubato and Jacqui Tricarico, find us online and follow us on social media.
Hi, my name is Alma Sarisia at Malcolm X Shabazz High School in Newark. I completed the FAFSA because it's a graduation requirement and to assist me with paying my college tuition. Last year, Newark students earned more than $77 million in scholarships and financial aid. Don't miss out. See your school counselor today. Let's Go to Work class of 2023. Complete the FAFSA or NJAFAA.
How do you create change? By cultivating hope. And we see that every day. In the eyes of our preschoolers, in the souls of the seniors in our Adult Day program, in the minds of the students at Robert Treat Academy, a national Blue Ribbon School of Excellence, in the passion of children in our Youth Leadership Development Program, in our commitment to connections at the Center for Autism, and in the heart of our community, the Northward Center, creating opportunities for equity, education, and growth.
Hello, I'm Dr. Luke Ironman, a family medicine specialist at Holy Name. When was your last visit to your primary care doctor? Throughout the pandemic, many patients have put off their annual physicals and screenings, but preventative healthcare is critical for early detection of illnesses and to avoid future health problems. Your doctor can also help you develop a wellness plan to achieve your personal health goals. Your health can't wait. Be proactive and talk to your primary care doctor today about scheduling your annual physical.